Hello, welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. New polling from the Center Square's Voter Voice Poll in partnership with Noble Predictive looks at voters' attitudes toward a number of issues in education. Some of these are split down party lines, but many show some more complex divisions. Joining me to break down the numbers is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, this polling explored a number of different issues, so let's walk through them kind of one by one. The first story you wrote about this looks at attitudes towards critical race theory in the classroom, as well as how people feel about the importance of focusing on the basics. Tell us more.
Yeah, no, it's a kind of an interesting thing there, Eliana. So essentially, the Center Square's Voter Voice poll found that the majority of people think that schools should focus on what the poll called hard subjects, such as math, reading, and science, and it found widespread support for those issues. Right, so it was across 87% of voters indicated that schools should focus on math, and that was across all party lines. So Democrats had 83%. Republicans, 90%, and true independents, 88%. So like all of these people are saying, yes, we should be teaching these hard subjects, math, reading, and science. I mean, these numbers don't change, right? Like these are sort of the reading, writing, and arithmetic. This is what people want. Interestingly, young people, Black voters, and those of other races, they were the most likely to disagree. So that's what it found. So I think that maybe they're looking for maybe alternative, maybe like softer sciences or maybe social emotional learning. That could be like a different kind of, we should be de-emphasizing some of the traditional things and maybe focusing on those different things. I'm not exactly sure. That's the hard part with some of this polling, right? Is that it asks, what do you think? It doesn't really give you reasons, right? So we're sort of left wondering, what would fill in that gap there. Only 10% of voters signaled disagreement. And so again, as I mentioned, young people definitely had the highest, 17% saying, no, let's focus on something else. And I think that's just a really interesting thing, but a lot of strong agreement too, with the least amount of strong agreement in Democrats. So Republicans, 67% said, let's focus on hard subjects. True independents, closely following, 63%, and then Democrats at 46%, but 37% still said somewhat agree to, do you think that schools should focus on these hard subjects such as math, reading, and science? So that was really interesting to see that in sort of those kinds of political affiliations. What also stood out is critical race theory, the approach to critical race theory, which has become, especially I think in the last few years, and I think sort of by design, I think Christopher Rufo has been sort of a champion against critical race theory, and this was sort of the goal was to sort of make it a third rail issue and make it very sort of controversial and talk about it in those kinds of terms. And that has, I think, that has polarized a lot of Republicans and independents too. So 51% of independents disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement that critical race theory should be mandatory in K-12 education. 71%, I believe, of Republicans said, they disagreed with that statement, that it should be mandatory. A majority of Democrats thought it should be. So this is one of those issues where the Republicans and independents are sort of against this. And I think against maybe that idea of like, this should be mandatory. If you start talking about what should be mandatory in schools, it starts to get sort of this top-down sort of imagery, I think, of like this should be there. So, it could be some of that aspect as well. But essentially, Democrats are in favor of having this be taught. And so I think it's one of those political divides. It's become like a sort of a controversial topic in boardrooms across the nation. And its states have banned ideas from critical race theory and sort of mentioned it in legislation about prohibited topics. So that's something that I think we're going to continue to see is sort of these debates over critical race theory. But it's, that was just a very interesting thing that the majority of voters kind of all the way through, when you add all those up, 51% strongly disagree that critical race theory should be mandatory in K-12 education. So if you look at everything, there's like that simple majority there. So it's a pretty split thing compared to with, hard subjects such as math, reading, and science. Like that is, everybody thinks we should be doing that.
One of the points that I find interesting there is that for at least a good chunk of voters, especially Democrats, is it's not necessarily an either or. They presumably think that something like critical race theory would go alongside teaching the basics.
Yeah. So I think that's true. I think that you can teach science, reading, and math, and then in like a social studies class, you would get some of this stuff about critical race theory.
Yeah, and for some people, it's more of an either or issue, and for some people, it's a both and. Moving on to another story that you looked at, where we also see some interesting divides. The poll also asks about parental notification policies. Can you kind of lay out the numbers on that one for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we're talking about with parental notification is, should schools tell parents if their child or if their student is using different pronouns at school, trying to change their gender, use different names, essentially. So this has become sort of controversial in recent years, just because there have been some school districts where it's been found that they have like a policy to not tell parents and try to protect students. In California, for example, the state has a policy that says you need to protect student privacy, and that means not telling parents about this. And so there's been some court cases, and I can get into that too if we want to. But essentially, it found that the majority of voters disagree that schools should allow students to use different names or pronouns without notifying parents. So essentially, people support parents being in the know very broadly. So Republicans, they saw the highest support for that. Democrats, that actually was the only political group where it was a 50% strongly or somewhat agreed that schools should be allowed to do this, be able to let students use different names or pronouns without notifying parents. True independents were kind of right underneath Republicans in their support for parental notification. So essentially, we have Democrats who are like on a wedge issue. Like 38% of them say schools should not be allowed to hide this from parents. And then the other 50% is saying, no, they should protect students. They should make sure that students are safe at school. And so that's one of those things that, kind of works in Republicans' favor. This is a wedge issue that splits Democrats, but Republicans are all about that. And that's something that David Byler from Noble Predictive Insights, that he was able to sort of lend some perspective on for actually another piece I wrote about the 2024 election, sort of Republicans gaining ground in education. But essentially, he basically said this is a wedge issue and Republicans can use that to their advantage because the Democrats are divided. And that's something we've seen in boardrooms as well. This kind of play out in boardrooms in states like California too, where it's like you might have the state saying one thing and then the school district sort of trying to comply with that. And then, teachers are suing or parents are suing and saying, this is violating my First Amendment rights or these parental rights. But essentially, David Byler said, voters believe that parents need to be notified and that there is a role to be played where parents get to raise their own children. And so that's what the poll found, essentially, that this is a very supported idea.
And you mentioned the story you wrote about how this is going to impact the 2024 election. Can you get into that a little bit more? How might these issues influence the election?
Yeah, that's a great question. So essentially, what David Byler told me was, that you find the Democrats have historically held the advantage. But I think, there are these sort of wedge issues, like these cultural issues that he said that are sort of the big things. Like we've had Democrats sort of globbing on to these kind of progressive, like farther left cultural issues like parental notification, right? Like critical race theory. Like they're saying these are the things that we need in schools and we're going to go out there and fight. But a lot of these independents and a lot of these maybe normal Joes out there who are just voters and they are in their communities and they want things to work well, they're seeing this and they're like, no, I don't agree with that. Or like critical race theory, that's sort of not what I want my kid to get. I want them to learn math, reading, and science. Again, they're the majority of voters who are saying, yeah, I want my kids to learn how to be a functioning member of society. So that's what Byler said, is some parts of the activist Democratic base, and I'm quoting here, some parts of the activist Democratic base have been picking up unpopular cultural fights. And so that, I think, is one of the larger things. And, it's not like this happened overnight. I think that they've kind of been picking some of these battles that are not super popular, right? And sort of, I think that that's part of it. There's also some complicated aspects of this in terms of like the nuance of like the bias of teachers. So I think they're worried about not having that balance in classrooms. And so when things are divisive or touchy, that there's the understanding that maybe conservatives are not being brought up. So I think that that's kind of there, that people are concerned that the liberal position is overrepresented in classes and a smaller chunk is worried about conservative perspectives being overstated.
And there was a poll on that, right?
Right. So that was one of the poll questions. 56% of likely voters think that teachers and administrators too often push a liberal agenda. 37% said that they push a conservative agenda. So there's a smaller chunk. But essentially, Byler pointed to the COVID-19 pandemic So this is not really in the poll, but he said that kind of really hurt Democrats sort of in their standing, because people associated the school closures with Democrats and saying, like, we need to be locked down, we need to be safe. The teachers unions kind of influencing some of those Democratic, maybe having some Democratic donations and those kinds of things being associated with them. So he said that kind of removes Democrats from being the party of the education party. So I think that was sort of Byler's perspective. We have some of these different sorts of bias concerns, and then also COVID-19 pandemic and the cultural issues. And those are the two big things that he really pointed to in terms of giving Republicans a lead. So I think that, we do have some of those wedge issues in some of that COVID-19 pandemic. And I've covered that a lot, the accountability, the test scores, that is still showing that there's a lot of learning loss from the pandemic.
Well, education is always an issue in the polls and an issue in elections, but we'll see how it plays out in the year to come. Listeners can keep up with this story and all stories related to K-12 education at chalkboardnews.com.
He ran for state office and was beaten, started a business and failed, ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.